Thought Leadership from PwC's National Office.
Hello, I'm Heather Horn, PwC's U.S. Sustainability Technical Leader, and welcome back to PwC's Accounting Podcast. This is Sustainability Now. In recent episodes, we've explored how sustainability reporting standards continue to evolve. Today, we're turning our attention to the GHG Protocol and its proposed revisions to the Scope 3 standard. To help us break down what it's changing and what it means for companies navigating these updates, I'm happy to be joined by Colin Powell, a partner in PwC Canada. Colin also serves on the GHG Protocol's technical working group for the Scope 3 standard, giving him a front row seat to these deliberations. Together, we're going to discuss the key areas of the Scope 3 standard's proposed changes, the challenges companies may face in implementing them, and what companies should be doing now to prepare. Before we get started, just a quick note. If you'd like to watch the video version of this conversation, you can find a link in the show notes. So with that, let's get started. So Colin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Heather.
Very nice to have you on. And I think one thing that's very interesting, we've talked a bit before on the podcast with these working groups that have been set up by the GHG Protocol, but I do think there's a bit of mystique who's on these working groups. How did you get on the working groups? How did they work? And those types of things. So before we even get into the background or into what's actually going on, can you just give us a little background of yourself? Sure. And then specifically how you got involved in this effort?
Sure. So I've been quantifying GHGs since like 2009, I think.
So a long time.
So that's given me a bit of runway to be able to get into these conversations. I'm a partner in PwC Canada, so I lead our GHG quantification decarbonization team, sit within a bigger team of climate change experts and sustainability experts. Getting on the working group itself, I do believe there were 1,200 applicants across the world. They were trying to balance like practitioners, auditors, those who may have a view from like another standard setting perspective. And it seems like actually on the working group that I'm on, it does have that balance. So they were able to split it up, especially the Scope 3 one. They were splitting it up into 3 separate groups, focused on particular things. And now actually there's what's called a phase 2, and they've brought us all back together.
Okay.
And I actually do really like this approach because it was a little hard to see what was happening in the other groups.
Yes.
So I had to spend my time focusing on my part, but if I really wanted to know what was going on, I'd have to dig into the meetings like anyone here could.
Yes.
But I would have to do that. And now they're bringing us all back together for phase 2, and it seems to be a bit more evolved, and the conversations are much more lively and engaged. So I'm very happy for that at this point.
Yeah. And I guess, Colin, just to level set, just to remind our audience, so there's actually 4 working groups overall. So there's the corporate standard, Scope 2 standard, Scope 3 standard, and then the market-based instruments. And so then you're saying within the Scope 3 standard, there were 3 groups within that. And then now you guys are all coming back to phase 2.
And they did a similar structure, I do believe, in the other groups to be able to have people focus on particular parts of it. And now they're bringing it all back together. And I think it's phase 2 for most of the groups, I recall. Yeah.
And I think you made a very important point there that there is a huge amount of public information available on the website. And I do think this is something that for people not on the working groups, this is just a huge benefit that you actually can go on the website. You can see all these sub-working groups. You can see the minutes. You can see the materials. And really, I think, get a flavor of what's going on, but not as good, of course, as hearing directly from you. But I really do. One of our recommendations to the GHG Protocol, along with many other people in our letter in 2023, was you need to improve governance. And I definitely think this is a huge benefit that they've made this change.
It's a dramatic improvement. And they talk about it a lot, honestly, during the meetings. So comparing it to the original approach to developing the standard, which I believe was just like completely black box, people sitting in a basement figuring it out. And that's quite clear. And they're deliberately making it more transparent. You can see everything. It's all online. It will take a very long time to go and dive in if anyone is very interested. But yes, like I do have a bit of that inside view and happy to discuss that.
Yes. And so then just again, a few more, I'll call them almost like logistical issues.
Yeah.
So how many people then are on your working group / the subgroup that you were on, and maybe the approach as well that's taken?
Yeah. So there was about 30 on each of the subgroups within the Scope 3 standard.
Oh, wow. So like 90 people total.
Yeah.
Okay.
And now so not everyone is speaking all the time. There is probably 20 people who generally go to the meetings or have gone to the meetings. I would say 5 to 10 people speak openly, but then they do polling either during the meeting or after the meeting. And generally that's like, hitting probably 25 to out of 30 people are responding. They generally do like to consider quorum when they're making decisions, at least draft decisions. So the governance is built in there to understand that they generally need consensus on things, which is, they've defined it as like there's no like real roadblocks for agreement on things. So if someone is like, I will not agree to this, I have a firm stand on this, they may want to continue talking or put it aside and come back to it. So that approach is definitely there. But you can see there is strong consensus in a lot of the changes they put forward, at least in the working group.
Yeah, and I guess maybe that was actually going to my follow-up question, because often, we in the firm have working groups. There's lots of different working groups. And often you find in working groups, people are coming at things with maybe their own particular bias or otherwise. And so sometimes it is hard to come to consensus because people have strong views. But you're saying you actually feel like you have been fairly successful in being able to reach that consensus.
Yeah, and it could be just the subject matter that's been covered to date. So we've been talking about like allocation processes in Scope 3, the uncertainty analysis, looking at specific things in Category 15. And so there's nothing that controversial there other than addition of requirements. But now we're getting into minimum boundary. And so that is where I think there'll be a lot of particular sector-specific input and challenges. And I'm already starting to see that. So we had a meeting on Thursday of last week, and a lot of discussion on Category 4 and 9. And like, we don't need to get into it today, but very, people who would always have emissions in that category, who may have a particular way of doing it, where there may be also sector-specific frameworks that may not agree with the GHG protocol. That's where we're going to start to see that the challenges, I think. And it's an opportunity for those who are not on those working groups to really have an input. And that's where you would read the minutes, be able to understand like what from a draft perspective, what it looks like, and then provide comment.
Yeah, and I guess maybe, again, just background. So you're meeting every few weeks, is that right?
3 weeks.
Every 3 weeks. Yeah. And then who is preparing all the papers and developing the initial points of view that are being discussed?
Yeah, and it's a massive undertaking. And so for the Scope 3 team, there's 3 folks from WRI. They've been managing the whole process, developing the decks for us to walk through, doing pre-reads, draft content, draft language of the standard that is also co-developed with some of the technical working group members. So they're putting an enormous amount of effort, and I thank them very much for doing that, to give us the content to discuss. And so I do believe there's other working groups for the other standards as well. And so just an enormous effort. And one really interesting thing is that's come up a few times, just because it's been so long since the standard has been revised, they have committed to doing this every 5 years at least.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it is just an enormous undertaking. And I doubt you're going to see such a wholesale revision, which my opinion was absolutely necessary.
Yes.
But at least the intention to do the revision every 5 years is there.
And from a level of knowledge point of view, in general, would you say the people involved in these working groups do have a good understanding of the practice issues? And also, you mentioned people with prior experience with reporting, like what good reporting is. I'll use that in quotes because there could be different definitions, but...
Yeah, it's clear. You can tell that everyone generally knows what they're talking about.
Which is very important.
Very, very important. So it shows they did a very good job of picking the working groups. And it's important because the structure they've put around decision making has been pretty good, and they've been adhering to it. So there's been 5 principles they've focused on. So any decision that is made, basically you're looking at, like, does it maintain scientific integrity? Does it align with the GHG protocol's principles like conservativeness, completeness? Is it going to drive ambitious action? is it interoperable? Is it going to align with the other standards? Basically, is it interoperable? And then is it feasible? Can you actually do the changes? Can you actually make it happen? And that's a key thing. And I think this will come up. We can talk about.
I want to come back to this. Yes.
And so generally, the approach is that you have to have a knowledge of like how these things are done, and what other standards have been out there on GHGs and how you've applied it before. And so that is the decision-making process. So going through each of those 5, saying like, okay, well, if we make this change, is it going to promote this thing or is it going to hurt this thing? And we've been pretty good at adhering to that. So I think that's been a good framework and a good change from the initial development of the standard, which I don't think had such...
Yes, these types of principles. I definitely want to come back to both feasibility and the broader standard setting approach. So the principles then, were those developed by the Independent Standards Board, or do you know who was that? WBCSD, WRI?
The original principles?
Well, these 5 principles that you're working towards now.
Yeah. So that was developed with the ISB, I think, and the WRI together.
Okay.
And they were basically presented to us as if like, okay, this is the way we're going to do this. There was a discussion of like, are these the right things? Again, consensus-based, like no one was saying, okay, no, I don't want to gauge it against this, or I have an additional one. So it was generally like accepted as the way forward.
Okay.
And it's worked.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
And you point back to it. And you see it's working because the working group members point back to that thing when there's a bit of like maybe a head-to-head on some things.
Yeah.
So let's follow back on these like 5 principles. Let's evaluate it against that, and we can move on if there's...
because I guess absent those principles, then how are you trying to decide? So that sounds like it's a really good starting point.
Yeah.
Okay, so one more question before we get into it. So you mentioned that you have 3 subgroups. So what are the 3 subgroups? And then what was your subgroup focused on?
Yeah, so there was an inventory quality one, and we can touch on that. That was really working through the different data types. So what data would you use? And we can talk on one particular thing, which has been, at least in draft, some data disaggregation and reporting disaggregation. Yeah. There was a few specific, so you had category specific groups. So I was on one that was category 15, the new category 16. This is a new draft.
Can't wait to talk about this.
And then the last thing we worked on was category 14. So there's been an expansion of the minimum boundary there. 14 was franchises. Could be draft, franchises, and licensing. So happy to talk about that.
Okay.
And the other was focused more on like what should be in and out. So exclusions, applying different parts of the like other standards. So what was decided in the corporate standard, how do we apply it to the scope 3 piece, really?
Yeah. So lots of follow-up questions, but you mentioned minimum boundaries. And I think for anyone who was in ESRS Wave 1 or who otherwise is entering into the world of required reporting, this question of minimum boundaries is a huge question. Obviously, that's been in place in the GHG protocol. I think there's questions under, potentially the other frameworks if you should apply them or not. But so for this purpose, really sticking with the GHG protocol, what were the discussions? Well, maybe we can remind listeners what those are. And then what some of the areas that you guys were focused on in looking at those.
Yeah, and we're actually still mid discussion on these. There have been proposed minimum boundaries. The last meeting I was at, I think we got to category 7, and so the next meeting will continue. But there's a few like broader structural changes. One of them is related to category 2 and how that's going to be treated. So anything capital equipment, and how is it going to be treated? Is it going to be amortized, or is it going to be the same way, which is like point of sale? And that actually impacts a lot of other categories. So that an additional change is, do you incorporate the capital equipment associated with upstream emissions? So from a transportation and distribution perspective, if you are paying someone to deliver a good, do you account for the upstream emissions? That's one addition to the minimum boundary or draft. And then do you account for the capital equipment to produce those fuels, for example? Again, this is all in discussion. There's nothing that is final, but that is the type of conversations we were having, which basically is like, okay, how much of that cradle to grave are you including in the accounting part of it. Because before that was all optional. It was
Right.
not in the minimum boundary.
Yeah. And I think it's important for this. And again, I think most of our listeners will be aware of minimum boundaries, but I will very simplistically explain them to say that if it's in the minimum boundary, then you consider it and measuring your scope 3. And if it's outside the minimum boundary or optional, then you can say, okay, that's outside. And really the idea there is so you don't have to keep measuring your GHG emissions. I think the original standard says ad infinitum, so forever. And I mean, you can very quickly go down some rabbit holes. Even sounds like you almost were going down some rabbit holes. So maybe on those two particular issues, starting with, whether or not you include the equipment and otherwise, and then the capital, where is the working group coming out? Sounds like it could be more complicated.
I think so. It doesn't seem like there's strong consensus yet. There's going to be a very focused discussion on how to treat Category 2, anything like capital equipment. So it really hasn't come up. Generally, that does seem like it impacts. It's very cross-cutting, cross-category cutting. So it seems like something we should discuss prior to a lot of those things. But it is like, we're trundling along as best we can. It seems like there's a bit of a split on how we want to incorporate that, say, in upstream fuels. So upstream fuels, it may be harder to allocate the impact of like the actual infrastructure to a fuel than, say, electricity, which is also a change because before Category 2 or Category 3 did not mention electricity. It was only fuels. I know we're getting into the weeds here.
That's
but
okay. I think our listeners are interested at least in a taste.
So like these are the decisions, right? It's like it said fuels in Category 3. And so the WRI said, well, why don't we expand it to electricity? And then,
although that is scope 2.
So then why don't we add on the infrastructure to that? And so then how do you amortize that either over the time period that the equipment has existed and then per unit fuel or electricity? So these are the things that are that really getting into, which I think is important. Like we have to have these discussions. It's just a little bit like hard to gather everyone's focus and attention and like balance the different competing priorities.
Yeah, and I think even this amortization question has come up a lot with even office buildings or otherwise, or if you've built a factory, then how do you consider those emissions? I also do think we're starting to hit the edge of feasibility, at least in my view, because you start to get where then everyone is just counting all emissions. And so it starts to lose a bit of meaning. So has that come up at all in the discussions? In this discussion,
I think a lot of it was around feasibility in that, for this bucket, emission factors are probably fine to obtain. This one, no idea where you'd even start to get emission factors for this. So what would you do? Are you going to make it zero, which is also not correct? Or so there's been that discussion, I think has been the primary one. And again, there's competing priorities there. Some folks on the working groups are like, well, we should be, ad infinitum. Like, I don't know why you would be stopping. Others are like, well, I don't have the data for this, so how am I intending to like fill the gap? How can I be complete in my inventory? Yeah, and it's one of the things we've been talking more broadly when it comes to standard setting in the sustainability space is if you look at the relative maturity, or we would say infancy, of sustainability reporting, then aren't we better off with the 80%? And then it sounds a bit like you're talking about the 20% if we're talking about 80-20 rule. And so don't we want everyone to do a really, really good job first before we start adding this? So has any of that flavor come up? It's come in mostly because, when the working groups, the sub-working groups came back together, it was kind of a presentation of how everyone had evolved and the draft decision was made. And so there was a lot of input to that conversation, like what does a good inventory look like? How do you disaggregate the data to show what is the different levels of quality? And then how basically you could present an inventory that is very much like still complete, but as best as you can get at the time. And you're seeing that. I think that will still evolve, obviously, as different comment comes in. But like, you're going to see a change in the way people are reporting these things ultimately. And then I think that will show of like, you'll see an evolution in data quality because of that. There's a lot of discussion of like, should you be forced to change your data quality over time? Like, should that be a shall in the GHG protocol? And then again, the disaggregation of the reporting by data quality tier, I think you'll see that probably be a shall as well. So that is a big change.
That will be a
companies.
huge change. And I think maybe can you just step back and give a brief explanation what that means? And then I'm going to equate it to financial reporting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there was, I think there was a big discussion of like, how do I, if I disclose my scope 1, 2, 3, I don't know how good that quality is. In the previous or the current standard, there is an indication that you should at least have a discussion on data quality. You should probably talk about where your emission factors come from, where your data comes from. And now the push is, well, how do we make sure that like a reader of this information knows how good the data is? And so they went through, I don't even know the number, like 8 or 9 different ways to chop up an inventory based on the data that went into it. And very similar to like a PCAF data quality score, which rates it based on the data that goes in. They were trying to find a way to do this. And so it seems like the way they have landed, and this is again all draft, and this is all open, you can look it on the internet, is specific data, non-specific data, and then spend-based data. And so if you were to disclose on your scope 3 or scope 1 or scope 2, you would have a number for your scope 1 in specific. So that's where you know exactly the fuel and you know the emission factor for that fuel. Non-specific, so maybe you're using proxies, and then spend-based. So you'd have 3 numbers for each emission source, and then you would have, for each category in scope 3, you would have 3 numbers.
Yeah, see, this is where it starts to get, I mean, it's very complicated then.
Yeah.
Yes.
That was, there wasn't a lot of discussion with the big group there because it was a subgroup decision. So I think the time for comment on that will come, but that will be a massive change.
Yes.
Obviously.
Yeah.
But when I think of it, as I prepare inventories for our clients, for example, we do have that information. Like we know, like if we were to, a client uses Excel, for example, like that's not a hard thing to do. It's just maybe a bit of a manipulation of the estimations and things like that. I guess it'll be a bit more challenging if you have a GHG accounting tool where the infrastructure in that tool is not there to disaggregate the reporting.
Right.
So it'll be an interesting change.
Yes.
And we'll see what actually the final version comes out. But ultimately,
I mean, it's interesting. I said I'd equate it to financial reporting because people from a financial reporting background will remember for fair values, they brought in a fair value hierarchy at level 1, 2, 3. And there was huge questions at that time as well. It's like, this is a lot of data. Is this going to be helpful data? And then, I mean, ultimately now that's been in place for quite a long time, and people are used to reporting the information. And I think people have found it useful, but also in general, reporting less numbers there. You're not, these different scopes and the different categories. So it will be interesting to see how that discussion with the broader group comes in. Other areas then where there's been sort of something that's come from I meant to ask you one more question on the minimum boundaries. Because one of the things we've talked about previously within PwC on minimum boundaries that I've heard you say is that, well, this should actually not be all this specification, but should just be principles, which I think there's obviously pros and cons. And I know where you stand, but can you just share what are some of those pros and cons and then why the working group seems like it's going in a different direction?
Yeah, I mean, there's been discussion throughout this whole process of like how specific do you want the standard to be?
Yes.
And a lot of people are on the principles-based side. Like, we have 5 principles in the GHG protocol. If you're generally aligning with them, how should you be aligned with the protocol? And then it's like, well, how do you audit that? How do you audit that? You've tried to get completeness in the particular emission source. And so the other side of it is we need to provide prescriptive guidance for every single calculation of an emission source. Like, how do you find which categories are relevant and not relevant? And so there has been a balance of this throughout, but it's almost like there's been a course correction because some of the complaints about the existing GHG protocol is just very vague. It's hard to apply it to different sectors. And so I think they're doing a bit of, as I said, course correct, but you're never going to get to a GHG protocol for every single sector or every single problem or every single...
Or something will change as soon as you get there.
Yeah.
Even if you did, then within a year, probably something would have changed.
I have clients come to me and say, hey, where's the GHG protocol section on data centers? And I'm like, it doesn't exist.
Exactly.
But think through the 5 principles of the GHG protocol, and we can come up with an approach that generally aligns with those things.
Yeah.
So I do like that approach personally, but it does seem like the actual standard would lean towards more prescriptive guidance. But it's almost to a fault. Like I've seen for one of the categories, they're trying to list all the activities that would be there. And I was like, there's 30 activities here, but there could be 10,000. So where do you stop?
Yes.
But it also gives like an example in your head of what they're thinking of when you're thinking of those particular categories.
Yeah. I mean, has there been a consideration of sort of a combined approach? So principles and examples, which is sort of what you just suggested.
I think that's where it's leading. Like they're not going to get rid of the principles, right? Yeah. So they're there and they can be leaned upon when there's maybe ambiguity or it's a application that may be a bit harder to see and eke out into the actual written standard. So it'll still be there. So I think it will end up being quite hybrid.
Yeah. I mean, again, I don't want to get into all the other standard setting right now, but this has been a area of debate under ESRS. I think there's a few different approaches where we did come to, at least for now, you could apply these minimum boundaries. Yeah. I think ISSB, there's probably a bit more debate. And so it will be interesting to see what happens in the interaction of the standards. But I think what we're hearing from reporters is actually a bit more prescriptive is probably helpful because then where do you stop and how do you think about something? Particularly, in cases where there is industry guidance, then that's quite helpful. But if there's not, then it's a bit difficult without the minimum boundaries.
Yeah. And one of the, just to continue that, like one of the interesting, more prescriptive things is there seems to be a move to put a 95% like inclusion requirement there. That was part of my working group. That was part of a few other working groups, at least for discussion.
Yes.
And so the number was arrived at 95%, which means you have to include 95% of your emissions, your Scope 3 emissions in your inventory.
Although then you have to know 100% of your emissions
so this
to know if you have 95.
This is the back and forth. Yeah. So how do you know it's 5?
Yeah, exactly.
And then the response is generally like, well, you have to estimate those. And well, it's like, oh, well, if I'm estimating, I would do it.
Yes.
So there's a bit of a rabbit hole there. And I don't think it was actually solved. Okay. And so I wonder if that will come back again.
I bet it will.
Yeah. There was no like firm like, oh, yes, let's do this. So that may be an open thing that will come back and probably more direct comment.
Yes. Yeah. So let's go to the specific categories then, because you mentioned 14, 15, 16. 16. Yeah. And so let's start with 14 and then lots of questions on 15, but let's go to 14 first.
So 14, there was a discussion of where to put this because it was something on licensing. And I think originally they had made licensing 16. So it was a new category, but it's been put into 14 as like franchises and licensing. And so the expectation is that, if I have a software license, which would be like a more digital service, you would account for the emissions associated with the downstream impacts of that license. But then there's also like hard licenses. So if I'm selling a design to a home, I would account for the emissions associated with the operation of that home, but also Scope 1, 2, and 3 of that. So that's another
building the home too.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, yeah. So that's another change of like when franchises originally on its own, the minimum boundary was Scope 1 and 2 of the franchise. Right. Now it's Scope 1, 2, 3 of the franchise, and so then they also expanded the category to include licensing. It is still very draft. You can read where it is in the minutes. We haven't really aligned on much there, but it's certainly the intention is to expand that category.
So before we go to 15 and then 16, one of the other big debates is this question of, we'd say, Scope 3 of 3. So when you're measuring your Scope 3 emissions, is it just the Scope 1 and 2? Or does it also include Scope 3? Current GHG protocol, most places is mostly Scope 1 and 2. And I think that is a bit easier for people, but it sounds like now you guys are moving more towards the Scope 3 of 3, but that again becomes a bit circular.
And where's the data that's not being reported? So, so it is expanded in the draft version of what we see.
Obviously, way more to come.
Way more to come. And I think a lot of the discussion there was like, where are we getting this data? And generally the response in the discussion is, well, if we require it, more people will report on the Scope 3, and so then it will be available to you. And so it's a bit of an evolution, obviously. And I think we always have this discussion. It's like, well, if I I require something, you're going to see more of it, and then it'll be like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we'll see how it goes. You'll have issues with completeness, I think, at the end of the day, and some very wild estimates for these things. But I think it happened with PCAF's evolution too, when they had the timeline for including different sectors, including scope 3 of those companies for different sectors. Like you're trying to fill that gap somehow, and you're maybe using a revenue-based approach or something that at least makes it non-zero.
Or lag. I mean,
exactly.
Like you're going to wind up with a lot of data lag as well.
Yeah.
One question I meant to ask you on the principles, because we didn't pursue this very much, is on the amortization. So this is a question that has come up a lot in terms of, do you include some type of amortized emissions for a building or otherwise? And again, I guess you could build that into a principle, but that does seem like the type of thing that you do need to be fairly specific about what the expectations are. What was the thinking about saying, okay, we should be including some type of amortized emissions?
I think it was alignment with financial reporting at the end of the day.
So,
and I imagine that's where it'll land, because and that goes to the interoperability part of the like decision-making criteria, where the intention in IFRS has gone this way, SRS has gone this way. It's just like aligning with the way you're reporting your finances.
So connectivity to the financial statements.
Absolutely.
Basically.
Yeah. So I think that's where it'll land, but we'll see.
Okay, more to come.
Yeah.
So let's go back. So we talked about category 14. Now let's talk about current category 15 before we get to this new category.
Yeah. So current 15. Basically, lending, investment activities, they're, debt.
Project finance with known use proceeds is there, but otherwise, yes.
So it's pretty bare bones, and ultimately, just because it hadn't evolved, it's been so long. And so PCAF has taken the mantle there and driven methodology and driven like at least somewhat minimum boundary there, but both are in discussion, I think, still. And so the broadening of the minimum boundary, manage investments on behalf of third parties, like that was out before, that was an optional and outside minimum boundary. Now it's in. And I think the other two parts of PCAF, which is facilitated emissions and insurance emissions, that was where it was like, what do we do with these at the end of the day? And so that's where 16 comes into play. And so the intention was to expand or make a new 16 to cover the facilitated / insurance emissions there.
Wow. So definitely some change. Was there a discussion then of PCAF is so focused on this, they've spent so much time on this, maybe that should just look to PCAF?
Yeah, there was a very long discussion of like, how do we refer to PCAF?
Yes.
Does it say PCAF in the actual standard?
Yes.
I do believe it was settled that the answer was no, or at least some like it will be referenced as a guide in general for methodology.
Maybe.
Yeah, exactly. So, but it wouldn't be category 15 C PCAF. Like it won't be so simple.
Yeah.
But with the recognition that PCAF has a mandate to develop methodologies, but likely not minimum boundary. And so PCAF will show you how to do things, but won't say you have to do this and you don't have to do this. That's where it seems it's going to land. And then where, like, because PCAF have gone so far and to develop facilitated emissions and insurance emissions methodologies, something has to be done with them in the protocol, because otherwise they're just absent.
Right.
And that the discussion was, well, let's make them category 16. But the interesting thing is that they are outside the minimum boundary. So 16 is outside optional.
Yes.
Unless you are an insurer.
Oh.
So that, again, this is all draft.
Yeah. We need to say that every minute.
Every minute I will say
this
that.
Podcast. Yeah.
And again, it's like, okay, what is an insurer? So there's a bit of a rabbit hole there. And again, none of this is final, but like the intention is to at least cover it, have it mentioned. And then it's very likely to say, okay, well, a lot of these things don't have methodologies at this point. And so that's why they were pushed outside of the minimum boundary.
Well, I mean, again, back to like you want to be able to present reliable data at some level. Then if there's no methodology at all, that doesn't seem like it's actually furthering reporting.
Exactly. It's a challenge. But I mean, so anything insurance related, claims payments, like there are methodologies, and then facilitated from an underwriting perspective, like there are methodologies. And so they were in this is where it got confusing. It is in the minimum boundary for 16. But 16 is outside the minimum boundary for scope 3. So that's something that needs to be resolved. But ultimately, it's like a discussion for the working group. And then there's a lot of other things that are considered facilitation, right? One thing that, like an obvious example, and it's come up for my work in Canada for our clients, of if I am a midstream oil and gas company and fossil fuels go through my pipeline, but I never really control it, do I account for the emissions there? And so it's a very obvious link to facilitated emissions, because if I own the pipeline, I'm facilitating an emission
delivery,
downstream, maybe.
Right.
Yeah. And so there's been nothing, everything is in draft. There's been a very big discussion of what that might look like. But it seems like it's leaning towards there will be guidance for doing it. They'll rely probably on the ESRS oil and gas sector guidance. That was a very specific
draft ESRS sector guidance, because it was non-finalized.
Because there's competing priorities there.
But then that's interesting, because you have the same thing with electricity and transmission lines.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, it's a whole other
It's a whole other thing. But again, it just shows the breadth that is being considered in these conversations. So, and I think that's a testament to the WRI and the folks working on this. They are thinking through these problems and bringing them to conversation. I think it's a very good process that's been happening.
Yeah, although it is interesting, because you mentioned potentially, or that the objective would be to update these every 5 years.
Yeah.
It almost seems like for some of these issues, maybe 5 years from now would be a better let's deal with all the baseline stuff right now, because we're so far behind. And then 5 more years of practice, we might have more information. I mean, I guess it'll be interesting to see as the discussions progress.
It's true.
What happens on that?
It's been 20 years, so there's a lot to catch up on.
So crazy. So I have many questions in my brain, but let's see where I want to focus next. So can you talk timeline then in terms of what, particularly for your group, what is coming next?
Yeah. So again, we're still working through minimum boundary. I think that is the key part of this particular phase. So phase 2, there will be draft language. And so we've seen a draft category 15 language, because it was the biggest change to any one of the categories, just because of the change in the minimum boundary. So we've seen draft language there. I don't think it's on the website yet, just because there were challenges with a lot of things. I will leave it at that. And so what we'll see is start to see draft language of the different categories for Scope 3 specifically. That will likely come in after Q2 of 2026.
Okay.
Yeah. It'll go out to public comment after that, because it does still have to go through the ISB.
Yes.
Any changes from phase 1, to my knowledge, are still with the ISB. And so they are still working through them. We will get told when they either come back to us for comment or they are approved tentatively. So there's a few other points where the ISB will provide comment, and then it will go to public comment next year. Their intention is still to publish the standard 2027. The one thing about this process, I would say, is that they were very deliberate in saying, we're going to do this, and we're going to have this published by this. And so even when there were some delays, they built in that time into the process. So they're still on time.
Okay.
As far as I know, we're still on time.
Okay.
So it's a 2027 publish.
Yes.
There's a few structural things still to be discussed. Does the Scope 3 standard sit alone? Are they going to all be put in one thing? And I think that probably can come.
Yes.
But at least in the near term, it's language revision, having comment, ISB, and then go out to public comment. Yeah.
Although I do think you said it can come, but some of the structural stuff is very important, because the fact that right now there's a lot of commingled guidance with sort of practice and otherwise, I do think makes it much harder to apply.
Yeah.
So that will be, to the extent you can push that along, that would be very helpful. So yeah. So, okay. One question you just reminded me when you mentioned PCAF. Obviously, there's a lot of other industries that have, or sectors that have sector-specific guidance. So as you guys have gone through the process, how has that been pulled in, if at all?
It's been good. I think just because of the diverse representation.
Yes.
For example, last week we're talking about category 4 and 9, and there's the GLEC framework, which is for transportation, and it's very focused on parcel delivery, things delivery. And so the discussion is, basically, how do we make sure that we're not duplicating efforts for a reporter under that would be covered, should be covered under the GLEC framework and GHGP? How are we at least aligning in the principles of both, so that if I am a reporter or a logistics company, I don't have to do 2 inventories,
Yes.
basically. So there's intention there. I think it just remains like how it actually gets executed at the end of the day. Because I think even in GLEC specifically, there are some gaps against the GHG protocol. Like GHG protocol doesn't do things the exact same way
Right.
GLEC does it.
Right.
So the intention is to align these things at the end of the day. So hopefully it gets there.
We'll see.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned the very beginning, one of the principles relates to interoperability.
Yeah.
And so considering other frameworks, but then this is a bit circular again,
Yeah.
because if we're talking about the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards and the European sustainability reporting standards, then they also refer to the GHG protocol, and they obviously have their own reporting considerations. So how is that feeding into any of the discussions you're having?
It's brought up a lot. I think ultimately there is the perception that the GHGP it's still standalone.
Yes.
It's meant to be referred to. It is not going to refer to others.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
you
that
won't
makes
see
sense.
mention of IFRS
Yeah.
S2 in there, right? For example.
Yeah.
But it is considering those standards. And like, if IFRS does this, why aren't we doing this?
Yes.
Because
Okay.
IFRS does get a lot more specific on a few things.
Mhm.
And it should be informing the way the GHG protocol evolves.
Yeah.
At the end of the day. So again, a bit of a
Yeah.
circular reference here, but because it is going to be and it is still referenced to
Mhm.
GHGP, it still has to kind of like be out in front of some of these
Yes,
things.
well, I agree. And I mean, we've even been talking about this there's currently revisions to the ESRSs
Yeah.
that you can't hold them static because they were interoperable 2 years
years
ago.
ago.
That
Yeah.
you need them to continue to evolve, or this reporting in general will
Yeah.
not evolve. So it sounds like it's sort of that same type of thinking.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's formal, but
Yes,
it
at least
is,
informal.
yeah, exactly. It's
Yeah.
being considered.
So we've talked about the Scope 3. I guess I want to briefly switch to Scope 2
Mhm.
because I believe, are expecting to see an exposure draft on the Scope 2 guidance coming soon in the
I
next
think so.
month
That's
or
what we've
two?
been told
Yes.
at the Scope 3 working group.
Yes. Yes. And I believe that's also what's on the website. And so just curious, from your perspective as someone who's on a working group, understand it's not Scope 2, but in general, that process and how people should try to get involved and maybe why it's important for companies and other stakeholders to get involved in that process.
Yeah, and I think from a comment perspective, it's quite important because there's been a lot of input into these every single step along the way. But ultimately, I have many people ask me, it's like, well, I wasn't picked for the working group, so I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah.
And the first thing is, okay, we'll go to the website.
Yes.
But there's a lot of information there. So it is ultimately like the culmination of a lot of work. And so it is the first opportunity to provide that public comment.
Mm-hmm.
And it is hopefully like a very good first view of everything together. Because that has been admittedly a bit of a challenge for the working groups.
So piecemeal.
Yeah, it's chopped up. And so there are probably structural things that we should decide on, but we haven't really covered them because we've been, looking at Category 14's
right.
minimum boundary, right? So it is the first opportunity to see this full spectrum of the changes, and it is probably going to be more impactful in terms of the final drafts or the final versions than what our working groups have been put in, right? It's because it's going to be considering a much broader perspective. It's going to look at much, much bigger views. There's going to be much more sample size of input. So I do think it's quite an important part, not to downplay the contributions of the working groups and the WRI that put into it now.
Huge
to get to this version, but ultimately the next step is where the biggest changes I think will come.
So then if I'm listening and I'm thinking, that's something I really need to pay attention to. And, this is actually coming quite quickly, slowly and quickly at the same time, I would say.
Yeah.
So what do you recommend when you're talking to clients and others about how to stay informed and what they should be doing right now?
First, I say come talk to me, but...
well, I don't think you want everyone listening to this podcast to email you or call you.
I don't have the time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the minutes of the meetings are actually quite valuable.
Mm-hmm.
They're put up promptly after each of the meetings. But again, they're a bit specific. You kind of need to fish through a lot of discussion to see where the versions, where the draft version.
Yes.
But that is ultimately the most public view of these things. I would say also the key points of engagement. So looking at the exposure drafts that's where you should be providing comment, and it provides the most fulsome view. I think that's where you need to kind of have that firm view, whoever, at a client or anyone, you need to come together and say, okay, well, actually, how does this impact me? And thinking through these things as a company, as a reporter, I think using the 5 criteria for decision making is also important, because you'll see it in the same lens that we saw it.
Yes.
So looking at feasibility is probably going to be a big part of any reporter's decision making criteria. So, and that's fine. Like, ultimately, give that comment that I don't have the resources to do this, or I expect this to be quite a burden. And those discussions, I think, are important ones to have.
Yeah, and I think I'll just chime in here. I think it's not just preparers, but everyone using this information, whether you are a investor or other type of stakeholder who's interested, you want all those perspectives when you're coming up with the final version of these standards.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So any final words of wisdom then to people either using the current standards or as they look ahead?
I mean, be prepared for changes ultimately. Like, there are some bigger changes, there are some smaller changes, there are very good clarifications. There's also things that will stay the same, like the 5 principles of the GHG protocol, like they're going to be there. I think be a bit nimble in how you'll prepare for those things. You know, I think in one of the first meetings it came up, it's like, well, if I am reporting against the GHG protocol today, should I just stop because I know it's going to change?
Oh my God.
I was like, no. And generally the answer was no. Like, please continue, because ultimately the spirit of these reports, like, it's going to still be there. There's probably just going to be an expansion of the things that you will have to report against. And so I think having a good understanding now of where it is directionally will help you prepare for, 2 to 3 years down the road, when that will be in place, when the standard will be final. Because it will change. It may expand the reporting requirements for some companies. So at least having an idea of what it looks like today. And ultimately, it may not be where it ends up in 2 years, but you'll have an understanding of what, like, expanded looks like, or the additional resource required to do it. So I think being prepared.
Yes. Well, it's really interesting, actually, when you were just speaking. I was thinking we have many clients that have been doing voluntary reporting now are preparing for reporting on GHG in California.
Yeah.
And so required to report under the GHG protocol, subject to some interpretations from the California Air Resources Board. But you need to know what's going on now. But then you also, whatever systems you're putting in place, you made the point at the very, very beginning, you need to make sure you're going to be flexible enough to deal with whatever's coming. So
yeah, it's interesting. And a lot of the California requirements in our clients, subject to them, we have been talking about doing Scope 3 in Excel, because it is going to change. The first report's required in 28.
So, Colin, one thing on the timeline is, let's just make sure that's confirmed with each other. So California reporters will do Scope 1 and Scope 2 in 2026 on 2025 information. And then Scope 3 1 year later in 2027 on 2026 information.
Yes, exactly.
All right, we got that. All right.
It's hard. It's been changing.
The lots of dates to remember.
Yeah. And so by then, the expectation is that the GHG protocol will have changed.
Yes.
And so are you prepared for that? And, we're preparing clients for that today. Like, if they don't have a Scope 3, we're like, let's think through this starting today, because it's a long process.
Yes, you cannot wait until that's required.
And so also be prepared that there may be changes to specific things. So at least being ready of, like, directionally where some of these minimum boundaries will go is a very helpful starting point.
Yes. All right. Well, Colin, this has been very informative. I think I need you to come back to New York soon so you can give us another update. But really a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right. And then to all our listeners/viewers, thank you as well for joining us today. We appreciate it. And we hope you join us again next week for continuing discussions of sustainability reporting, and including another episode on GHG. And to make sure you never miss any episodes, please subscribe on whatever platform you listen or view podcasts on. Or, as always, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter at viewpoint.pwc.com. Thanks again for joining us today.